Matt, thanks so much for talking to me today about this. Can't wait to kind of dig into what this 2025 report came out with. I know you're one of the editors, so the best person here to give me a broad overview of what this looked at. Can you give me some basics first on the Arctic Ice Report Card, how often this comes out and what it generally tells people?
Yeah, so this is the Arctic Report Card. It is supported through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a federal agency. So it's supported by NOAA, but we have an independent editorial team, and we have authors from all over the world. This year, we have 112 authors from, I think, 13 different countries. We've been producing this report annually since 2006. So it was kind of special to get the report out this year because it marked our 20th edition of the report. It's really focused on observations of different parts of the Arctic system. And it is looking at observations of the current year. And because we do it every year, we're able to stack up all those observations and not only see what's happening in the current year, but also look at that in the context of long-term trends.
Okay, and it's not just looking at sea ice, right? It's looking at a lot of different things.
Yeah, so there's value in looking at some of the same things every year. And so there are what we call the 8 vital signs, and these are aspects that we track every single year. And this is Arctic sea ice, the Greenland ice sheet, surface air temperatures, sea surface temperatures, the greening on the tundra, the primary productivity or kind of the phytoplankton production in the ocean, and then snow cover. And so across those, precipitation as well. So those are aspects that we track every single year, and we maintain this long-term data set. We also track other features less frequently, just because we can't capture everything in a single year. So this year, for example, we're looking at the melt of glaciers and ice caps outside of Greenland is one. And we are also looking at topics that are kind of emerging as priorities in Arctic research and priorities for monitoring. One topic this year that we covered is rusting rivers, which got a lot of attention when we released the report last week.
Yeah, can you tell me what that is? Because that is kind of something that stands out and is interesting because I think the general population is like, what does that mean? What is that?
Yeah, well, I think before you dive into what is rusting rivers, it's important to acknowledge permafrost. So permafrost is something that we also have looked at periodically through the Arctic Report Card. It's certainly an important component of the Arctic system. Permafrost is frozen soil, and as the Arctic warms, that frozen soil thaws. And one of the things over the last 10 years that has gotten a lot of attention, especially in the last 2 years, is the emergence of what are being called rusting rivers. Most of the observations we report on are from Alaska, but this phenomenon is across much of the Arctic. And what's happening is as the permafrost thaws, there is iron that's locked up in that frozen soil that's released, and that iron and other heavy metals are oxidized and gives these watersheds this rusty orange color. And so it's raising the acidity of these rivers as well as giving them that orange color and introducing toxic metals as well. And so it's harmful for fish, and it's potentially harmful for communities downstream that rely on this water for drinking.
Gotcha. Okay, the 2025 report card, what does that reveal? What's noteworthy for this year?
Well, over the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of trends that are all going in the same direction. Amplified warming in the Arctic. We can clearly see that the Arctic is warming much faster than the globe overall. What was striking this year is that we saw the warmest year ever recorded in the Arctic since at least 1900 when regular observations began, as well as the most precipitation ever in the Arctic in a given year. And to see the occurrence of both of those records in the same year was quite striking. Certainly we understand that as the Arctic warms, that we do expect to see more precipitation. So it's something that's understood, but to actually see those two records in the same year was just quite remarkable and underscored a lot of what we understand to be true about the future for the Arctic.
Can you tell me more about the tools that are used to gather the data? From everything from technical tools down to Indigenous communities and the role that they play.
Yeah. Well, because we update the Arctic Report Card every year, we do have to utilize reliable data streams that are essentially collecting data in real time. Typically, that is satellite-based observations. And so across those 8 vital signs that I mentioned, we are primarily using satellite observations. Although those satellite observations over the years have been fine-tuned and calibrated using ground-based observations of people on the surface making measurements and using different instrumentation. And so that kind of blending of satellite with what we call in situ or in-site observations is really critical. We also have in the Arctic Report Card over time increasingly brought in Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous knowledge from across the Arctic. It is, it's critical for understanding what's really happening in the Arctic and important for understanding what it means to kind of live on the front lines of the changes that we're seeing. In this year's report, we highlight an initiative at St. Paul Island, Alaska, which is a small island in the Bering Sea. And they have, over many years, have been building this program to essentially conduct observations, conduct research on their island. And one of the most important roles that local observing program plays is tracking mercury and the foods that the community harvests, whether it be seabirds or marine mammals.
Interesting. Is there anything that you've gotten from using the people that live there that surprised you, that's been an impact that's been surprising to you?
Well, I mean, it makes conducting this work so much more meaningful. You can look at long-term warming trends from satellite, but that doesn't speak to what it means to be living on the ground in communities that are experiencing this warming firsthand. I mentioned thawing permafrost. That's something that we're seeing impact communities all across the Arctic, with infrastructure essentially collapsing as the ground beneath them thaws. One of the things that we did highlight to some degree in this Arctic Report Card is the aftermath of this very large ex-typhoon storm that hit Alaska in October. I say we covered it somewhat in that it happened in October, and we were just kind of in the final stages of putting our report together, so we were unable to incorporate a whole lot of work around what took place. But this was a storm that came up towards Alaska in October when waters in the Bering Sea were well above average. That warm water in the Bering Sea added to the strength of this storm, and it hit western Alaska, and it displaced over 1,500 people in the region. It decimated several communities. And right now, today in Alaska, these communities are still figuring out how to get back to their daily lives. And that, I think, is a really good example, a very sad, somber example of what climate change means for the Arctic. Warming waters, more powerful storms coming north. And one of the things that we acknowledge in the report this year is that the Arctic in Alaska has only seen, in recorded history, 4 of these types of storms really enter into the Alaskan Arctic, and 3 of these ex-typhoons have all happened in the last 5 years. So likely to be something that communities there will be dealing with more regularly, unfortunately, in the future as waters off of Alaska increasingly warm.
Why does this report card matter to people living in the rest of the world?
Well, the Arctic it regulates our global climate. It is in many ways one of our refrigerators for our planet alongside Antarctica. And as we see the reduction in Arctic sea ice and as we see declines in snow cover, and that's one of the things that we highlight in this year's report is just dramatic, how dramatically late spring snow cover across the Arctic has decreased. So as you lose that white reflective sea ice and that white reflective snow, you are reflecting much more incoming solar heat. You are absorbing so much more incoming solar heat, warming the Arctic, which in turn warms the entire planet. And so while a warming Earth helps to warm the Arctic, it goes both ways. And so rising global temperatures are increased with diminishing ice and snow in the Arctic. Another is that as we see global temperatures rise and global water temperatures rise, we see that storms, just like we did this past year off of the coast of Alaska, gaining more strength from these warm waters and having a very far-reaching impacts on coastal communities that are lie-lowing, that are kind of being exposed to storm surge.
Yeah. I noticed in the last line in the I don't know if it was the NOAA release, in the last line of the summary, it mentioned something about how gaps in coverage hinder scientists' ability to monitor environmental changes. And I'm curious what that was in regards to.
Well, one of the things that we did include this year, and it's the second time in the report card's history, is an assessment of the Arctic Observing Network, which refers to all sorts of instruments, including satellite instruments, including instruments that are stalled in the ocean. They all, in many ways, do form a network in the sense that the science community very often is aiming to openly share data, across the research community working in the Arctic, so that we can have a firm grasp on what's changing. One of the things that we always encounter are observation programs reaching their lifetime. And as they reach their lifetime, we have to be prepared as the nation to invest in the follow-on observations. And that has to be done in a really thoughtful way, because data consistency is incredibly important as you look across time. If we want to be able to reliably say how much it's warming, how quickly, what the future will look like a decade from now, it really relies on consistent observations fed by instrumentation that is very carefully developed. It's not something that's new. I mean, this is always on the minds of scientists, is how to maintain these long-term observations. But it's increasingly of concern as we see priorities for research shifting.
What about wildlife? Is there talk of the impacts on wildlife in the report?
We do try every year to include one or two essays on the animals of the Arctic. Not only do people love to read about it, but it's obviously really important. And animals can often be some of the best indicators of change. And so across the report, we've looked at everything from caribou to seals to whales to beavers. This year, we have an essay on fish in the Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea, which are two of the seas off of Alaska. And that essay, we refer to the chapters in the report as essays. In that essay, it is looking at how some of the subarctic fish are moving northward and moving into the waters that have been occupied by Arctic species. And at the same time, you see the population of those Arctic species decline. And so this is referred to in the scientific community as borealization, which is the movement of more southerly species northward, very often displacing those Arctic species. And so we see this in fish in the Bering and Chukchi Seas, but we also see it on land with vegetation that would be typical of what you'd see in the subarctic moving northward into the Arctic. And that's referred to as the greening of the Arctic. And that's one of the vital signs that we track yearly.
I saw the term Atlantification used. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So we cover this year as well. So Atlantification is the influx of warm, salty water from lower latitudes. So waters from the Atlantic up into the Arctic Ocean. And this is something that has been observed as happening periodically throughout history. And so the process itself is not all that new, but the scale of its impact at the moment is what's striking. And so in Arctic waters, you get these layering of waters based on temperature and salinity. And typically you have a very cold, fresh layer above a cold, salty layer of water. And then beneath that, you have this warm water that moves up from the Atlantic. And we're seeing that this water, as it gets warmer, is kind of eroding this stable layering and exposing the sea ice to these warmer temperatures. And so it's driving enhanced sea ice melt. And what it's also doing is it's creating this mixing. And what that mixing does is it introduces nutrients into the upper waters, which changes the way that the ocean produces phytoplankton. And so that is driving ecosystem change in very complex ways that I think we're still beginning to fully understand. What's amazing is that you're seeing the signature of this warm Atlantic water all the way at the North Pole in terms of its impact on sea ice and introduction of small creatures in the water.
I know there's not much land in that area that you're studying. Are any of these spots becoming tourist locations? It seems like the Antarctic is like blown up with tourism. Is there anywhere in the Arctic that's kind of a hotspot for tourism?
Well, not my area of expertise. Certainly there are more cruise ships off of Greenland, for example, than there used to be. And there's, a lot of talk of more navigable waters in the Arctic in general. While that is true in one sense, one of the things that we often stress as we see sea ice melt and sea ice retreat is that the ice that we have today is much thinner than it was, say, back in the 1980s. But because that ice is thinner, it can be moved much more quickly by currents and by wind. It's kind of heavy. It's not as heavy, so it's much more mobile. And that mobile ice means that it's much more unpredictable. And unpredictability for people operating, working in the Arctic means more hazardous in a lot of. And so as we are seeing just a general increase in tourism and definitely an increase in the interest in tourism, that's something to really keep in mind, is that warming in many contexts brings greater uncertainty.
So there's the danger, but then also if you get a bunch of Instagram influencers out there with their cameras showing what's going on in the Arctic, that could be a good thing too. So I guess it's a balance of the two.
Yeah, tourism is something that has to be dealt with quite carefully. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but many of these communities are ones that have never had tourism in the past. So increases in tourism can bring economic benefit for sure, but if it's not done properly, it can also be very harmful for communities and also harmful for the ecosystems where cruise ships might want to visit. And many of these communities obviously don't have the infrastructure that's needed to be able to accept large cruise ships.
Matt, is there anything else you want to add about the report? Anything we didn't touch upon that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think, and by just repeating a bit of what I said earlier, of really this importance for maintaining observations in the Arctic. We see clear directional change in terms of air and waters warming, but there are many implications of this warming that I think we're just beginning to understand. We touched on this a bit with the rusting rivers and with the impacts on fish, but the warming is touching every corner of the Arctic, and we really need to have eyes on the ground, scientists on the ground working with communities to be able to see these things as they're unfolding.
Is the goal to prepare these communities or to educate the rest of the world, or all of the above?
Well, I would say it's all of the above, although I wouldn't say scientists' goals necessarily to prepare these communities. Our Arctic communities are some of the most adaptive in the world. I think we probably stand to learn more from them than they may be able to learn from us. But I think we have seen across the Arctic the emergence of really strong partnerships. And I think that partnership is really what I'm underscoring the importance of.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for all this information today. This is very interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you, Emily, for covering the Arctic Report Card.